Teetering on the brink of recession and divided over nuclear energy, now Japan and its candidates prepare for crucial parliamentary elections. But with 6 prime ministers bowing out in as many years, what can a 7th do to revitalise the world's 3rd largest economy? It is election time in the land of the rising sun. This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. So the official campaigning starts here. Leaders of Japan's political parties laying out their visions for the future as the country stands at something of a crossroads, really. And the direction it takes could determine whether Japan can remain as one of the world's leading nations or continue its slide of the last few years. Number one, Japan needs to boost its flagging economy, but it goes further than that. There is massive public debt. There is an aging population. There is an energy policy which was thrown into doubt after the disaster at the Fukushima nuclear plant. And don't forget, Japan's still embroiled in those territorial disputes with China and South Korea. The trouble is, observers are predicting the polls could lead to a weak coalition government with no clear view of how that might be made up. And really, in the end, who would want the job of Japanese Prime Minister? It has not been kind to anyone who's filled the post in recent years and would certainly rank as one of the most daunting tasks in world politics. Lots to discuss on today's show. First, this report for Inside Story from Mariana Hond.
It's one of the closest election contests in Japan in years. As campaigning kicked off, 41% of Japanese voters were still undecided. And based on the last 6 years, many voters have grown to view their leaders with even-handed disdain. Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda of the Democratic Party of Japan is the 6th Prime Minister in as many years. His main rival, Shinzo Abe, of the opposition Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, had a short-lived stint as Prime Minister too. This all started back in 2006 with the country's faltering economy. But this election, many are watching to see whether Prime Minister Noda and his DPJ will pay for a poor response to the Fukushima nuclear crisis.
We are reaffirming our belief that the reconstruction of Japan is not possible without the reconstruction of Fukushima. We hope to start Japan's rebirth.
We will seek the recovery of Fukushima, a disaster zone, as soon as possible. We will create a Japan in which those born here will feel joy and regain a nation in which our children will be proud to be born in.
Reassuring words of reconstruction, but both deliberately ambiguous about the future of nuclear power. One poll shows around 80% of Japanese want an end to it, but neither party has a clear stance either way. But the economy is where many believe this election could be won or lost. Japan's been overtaken by China as the world's 2nd largest economy. And new forecasts suggest its GDP in the current quarter will fall by 0.4%, which could push the country into its 3rd recession since 2008. 2 new political parties have formed in the last few weeks, born, it seems, out of a growing disaffection with Japan's established leadership. Neither of the main parties is expected to win an outright majority, an indication that mistrust isn't expected to ease anytime soon. Mariana Hond for Inside Story.
So here is our central idea for today. It's a pretty simple one. Who has the plan to save Japan? I want to introduce the panel to you. In Tokyo, first of all, is Michael Penn. He is president of the independent Shingetsu News Agency. In London is Seijiro Takeshita, director of Mizuho International, investment banking arm of Japan's Mizuho Financial Group. And rounding out the panel in Tokyo via Skype is Gerhard Fasol. He is the CEO of Eurotechnology Japan, dealing with business in the country's technology sector. So thank you to all 3 of you for joining us. We're going to look at a lot of specifics later on, economy, nuclear, all these sorts of things. But I want to start with some general stuff about the election. Michael Penn, I'll come to you first in Tokyo. You could look at this as a crucial election. Japan at a crossroads is how we described it earlier on, but you could also say it's almost a washout before it started. We pretty much know it's going to be a weak coalition that might come through. You might have to have a 3rd party involved. It's actually not a good sign for the future, I would think.
Yes, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, clearly the political instability in Japan is going to continue. Even if the coalition that seems to be leading right now, led by the old Liberal Democratic Party, even if they gain a majority in this election, which is not for sure, but if they do, they still have another house of the parliament, the House of Councillors, which is dominated by the opposition. So clearly, we're going to see divided government continue at least until next July.
You make that point about the Liberal Democratic Party, and I find it quite, well, let's just say interesting that it's Shinzo Abe who is leading the party at the moment, a man who you could say failed in this job 6 years ago. And we're going to get onto that later on, all the failures over the last 6 years. But I mean, is Shinzo Abe the right man for this?
Very few people think so. Clearly, he did have a very good chance in 2006 to 2007. At that time, he was handed a very powerful majority by his predecessor, Junichiro Koizumi. He badly mismanaged it, and his return to power is almost as much an accident as it is something that he earned.
Seijiro Takeshita in London, let me bring you into the conversation. Your thoughts on the political makeup of things, the fragmented style that it looks like we're heading towards.
Well, I always say this when I describe about the Japanese politics, but I really do think it's like reading Shakespeare. You don't know when to cry or when to laugh, really. And it's the same situation. As the gentleman described, there is no strong top-down leadership that could be expected in any of the leaders because it's fragmented. In fact, the third party, which could be the cardholder to tipping the rights or the power of autonomy, Nihon Ishin no Kai, that's led by Mr. Ishihara and Mr. Hashimoto, both of them are basically stating very clearly that they would not abide or basically team up with LDP or DPJ. So the fragmentation is becoming a lot clearer than any of the election that we've seen before.
But could they benefit from a bit of voter apathy from voters who don't want to go either way with the two major parties?
Yes, very much so. What's really different from, let's say, 2009 or 2005 is 2005, yes, we had the Koizumi-san giving his, I would say, abolition of the vested interest. And many people voted on back of that. And now 2009, every Japanese was sick and tired of LDP's vested interest. So they wanted change. They wanted somebody else. Anybody but LDP. Now, those were the two very strong trends that we're seeing. But this time around, there really is no strong trend like that because we all know that we need to make that transitional change away from DPJ. However, in saying that, a lot of negativity that DPJ inherited was initially seeded by LDP. So this is making, as you just noted, the third party resurgence are quite strong in this arena.
Let's bring in Gerhard Fasol now, who's on Skype for us from Tokyo, and we thank you for joining us as well. Start talking about economic issues. Obviously, I'll come back to Seijiro about that later. But first to you, Gerhard. I mean, trying to fix this Japanese economy, that's a job in itself. You've got plenty of jobs to do as Prime Minister, but I mean, where would you even start with the economy?
Well, first of all, I'm not the Prime Minister, of course, fortunately. But I think there are maybe three major issues in Japan for the economy, or four even. With a long distance, the most important issue is the aging society, and you have a low birth rate in combination with low immigration. And so the population ages and also loses, when people age, usually they have less energy, not all people, not most. So it is a less, the vitality of the society is kind of decreasing. That's one issue. It's combined with a very large government debt, which fortunately for Japan is largely inside Japan. So it's essentially a debt between the Japanese government and the Japanese population. But what that means is that the government is now stimulating an economy which is currently more or less in recession. But that stimulation money is all borrowed money, so it increases debt. And so it hands off the problem to future generations, which are getting less and less.
Okay, let me interrupt you a second, Gerhard, if you don't mind, because I do want to put what you've started to talk about, I want to elaborate and put some numbers to it, because, on the face of it, you could almost say Japan is in good economic shape because, as we've mentioned, it is still the world's third largest economy. You don't get there by mistake. But when you look at GDP, gross domestic product, which is the value of goods and services produced, just want to show this to our viewers. The US, a clear leader, obviously, GDP of more than $15 trillion. China next at $7 trillion, and then Japan at about $5.8 trillion. But the key is we need to talk about growth, because Japan's growth rate hit an all-time low. Minus 3.9% in June of 2009. That's a while ago now. Latest figures show a fall of almost 1% in the last quarter. And then another fall that's forecast at, 0.4%. That would tip Japan into its third recession since 2008. So it's got serious problems there, as well with, and stay with me here, debt to GDP ratio. Debt as a percentage of GDP. United States, just to give you an example, it's at more than 100%. China, a little over 25%, it's said to be at least. Here is the big problem for Japan. It owes more than twice as much as it is worth, with little chance of paying it back. Gerhard, I'll stay with you quickly for this one. And this is a debt problem for so many countries at the moment. How do you pay back when you're not making enough money, when export demand from all over the world is dropping? And I'm sure you'd know this with the technology sector. How do you do it?
Well, in Japan, the huge difference between Japan and, let's say, Greece is that in Greece the debt is to external banks, or to financial institutions, whereas in Japan the debt is almost all inside Japan. It's essentially the savings of the Japanese people net out essentially the debt of the government. So it's it's a very differently structured problem. Okay.
Let me jump in, because I'd like to bring Seijiro back in. Sorry to interrupt. I want to bring Seijiro back in because obviously he deals with finance as well. Do you see anything, Seijiro, from any of the parties policy-wise that looks like it could correct things, or at least get them on the right track?
Well, I don't think they're acutely worried about the problem that we've just been discussing about, because, well, to add to what the gentleman was saying, we're also the world's largest creditor as well. And of course, the composition of debt itself, as the gentleman explained, is quite different. But of course, it is a worry that we have in the long future. What's most important, and that's being argued right now by these parties right now, is what to do in the near future, or the next 2 years, for example, basically to fight off this deflationary state that we've been in for almost 15 years now. And moreover, what to do with a strong yen. And this is associated very much with the nuclear problem, but what to do with the energy side, because energy prices in Japan is skyrocketing, which is adding further burden to the already burdened exporters who's suffering from this excessive strength of the yen. So these are the acute arguments that's been going on in Japan, especially among these parties.
You have preempted things beautifully, Seijiro, because I do want to talk about the nuclear issue and what makes it such a big election issue. You could say in some ways it's more to do with what happened after the Fukushima disaster, because before that, of course, nuclear power provided 30% of Japan's electricity. It was the world's third biggest nuclear generator. And the government had aimed to increase that to 50% by 2030. Now we have a situation where currently only 2 of Japan's 50 reactors are in operation. And the ruling party has sort of changed its stance. Well, actually, entirely it's changed its stance and said we're going to have this target of 0 nuclear power plants operating by 2030. Michael Penn, we haven't heard from you in a while, so I'll bring you back in. How do we solve the electricity problem? Seijiro's made a really good point there, in that Japan does actually need this nuclear power. It's an island, it can't just pipe in electricity from anywhere, and yet we're going down this path of no nuclear.
Yes, well, this is one of the most divisive issues in Japanese politics and society right now. I mean, there is a genuine bottom-up popular movement against nuclear power, which arose after the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. And politicians have to consult the opinions of the public. And the opinions of the public is that in a country that is as earthquake-prone as Japan is, that nuclear power may be too much of a risk here. That maybe they made a mistake in their energy policy in the 1970s.
That's all very practical. That's all very practical what you say, especially in light of the disaster, and we all saw what happened. But the alternatives, again, is anyone coming up with alternative ideas here, any of the candidates?
Well, the alternatives are coming up, but everybody agrees they're going to take time. It means, there's a lot of investment going on in solar energy and other forms of renewable energies. There's a great focus on that across Japan at many levels, not just at the top level, but at the level of business and local governments. So there is a change happening here, but it's going to take time. And the question is how much of the nuclear power will be needed to bridge to that future of a different kind of energy.
Gerhard Fasol, do you see that, what Michael's talking about, more ideas, more investment, people looking at alternatives, enough?
Okay. The energy issue is very complicated, of course. And the situation you have in Japan is that you had a monopoly of 10 regional power companies. Yeah, the biggest one is Tokyo Electric, which was more or less nationalized now. And this structure has been installed like 20, 30 years ago and hasn't been changed for 30 years. And so the framework of the energy architecture of Japan was frozen in for like 30 years, whereas that sector advanced a lot in Europe. Yeah, wind power and deregulation and separating the generation from the grid from the distribution, that was proceeded in Europe and proceeded in US, and markets developed, and a lot of know-how was developed. So Japan has a lot of the technology know-how, but Japan has far less know-how on how to run a liberalized electrical industry. Yeah? So Japan has a lot of catching up to do there, and that is happening now, but pretty slowly. So that is the structure of the industry. Yeah? Then the other issue is the nuclear issue. The nuclear issue is very emotional. Many people have strong emotions. I'm a physicist, so I see it from the physics side, right. But I try to keep back my opinions because other people are so emotional.
Well, it's tough, isn't it? We all saw what happened, but to live through that must have been something quite extraordinary. I want to move on to one more issue before we then look at the history of Japan's prime ministers, and that issue is these territorial disputes. Seijiro, no one likes an argument with the neighbours, especially when it's a big neighbour, a big important neighbour like China. However, is this sort of thing, is it an election issue?
Oh, very much so. This is one of the major issues, definitely, that, as we just depicted earlier, a third party wants to bring about. And also, that's one of the reasons why LDP is becoming very hawkish, looking at the sentiment of the Japanese public, who is basically being sick and tired of being pushed around. So obviously, I personally think this could be a very dangerous thing, although I do think DPJ's foreign policy is extremely boneless and spineless. But in saying that, we do not want the move of protectionism, especially under the times when the world recession is being seen at the corner right now.
Gentlemen, there is one issue we haven't looked at yet, and it's actually the one I've been really waiting to get into, and that is the history of, well, the last 6 years, if we'll say. Because recent history would suggest that the job of the Japanese Prime Minister is not one many would actually want, given that there have been 6 Prime Ministers in the past 6 years. I just want to take our viewers through that so they understand the history here, because we had, 5 pretty strong years, or good years, you might say, under Junichiro Koizumi, as Michael mentioned earlier. Shinzo Abe succeeded him. We're going back here to 2006. He was elected by the Liberal Democratic Party. He only lasted a year because of poor health, though poor approval ratings, I think, were a factor too. Yasuo Fukuda stepped up as the next leader and then was promptly gone after another year because of a deadlock between his party and the upper house. This brings Taro Aso to power. Guess what? He only lasted a year too. But this time it was because the LDP was hammered in those 2009 general elections and lost power for the first time in 54 years to the DPJ. It was a major turn. The thing is, the DPJ didn't actually do much better. The new Prime Minister by this stage, 2009 now, was Yukio Hatoyama. He broke that promise to close the US military base on Okinawa and then resigned over it, and he only lasted 9 months, didn't even get the full year. His successor, Noato Kan, not doing too badly, but then he had to, and as we've discussed this, he had to deal with the fallout from the earthquake and the tsunami and the nuclear disaster. And as I understand, he tried to resign a year into the job. He then survived a no-confidence vote, but then eventually stepped down after 15 months. Which brings us to the incumbent, Yoshihiko Noda, who at this stage has lasted longer than any of his 5 predecessors. Michael Penn, why is this position so notoriously difficult from either side? You can't just say that one party struggled here and had to keep re-electing. 3 men from both sides have had a go, and none of them have really got there.
Yes, well, the answer to that is very complex. But basically what you can say is there's a systemic crisis in Japanese politics which hasn't been resolved yet. Some of the factors that are involved in this are, and the post-war period, Japan basically was a one-party system or a one-and-a-half-party system. And as that system began to break down in the 1990s and the early 2000s, nothing really came up to replace it. Another institutional factor is the House of Councillors. There's a very powerful upper house. And so it means that Japan is always sort of going to have trouble with divided governments because you have two houses on different electoral schedules represented in different ways. So it means that parties are going to have trouble. And a third issue that has to be mentioned is that the bureaucracy, the national administration, often has more policy-making power than the politicians themselves, in part because they have the control of the flow of information, and the politicians are often isolated even as they try to make policy for the nation.
Even so, listing all of those things, 6 in 6 years is ridiculous. I mean, that doesn't really happen very often in any other countries. I'm trying to get to why this has happened maybe at this time. I mean, there's economic problems for sure, but why has this happened at this time to Japan?
Well, I think it's just that the old Liberal Democratic Party, which was strong enough to control both houses, disintegrated, or at least it declined enough that it lost control. And the Democratic Party, which might have succeeded in bringing stability, was attacked from all sides, and they divided against themselves, and they failed.
Okay,
I mean, if Yukio Hatoyama had been a different sort of person, we might be telling a different story.
Seijiro, Michael just mentioned stability there. The other word I was thinking of, if it is a word, is stickability. Where is the Japanese politician who sticks to his guns and battles on and doesn't, and forgive my phrasing here, fall on his sword after a year?
Well, unfortunately, I think one of the reasons why they haven't been able to adhere for a long time in office is going back to what we've been initially talking about, and that is the economic situation. The LDP could not basically, or the DCB in the past 3 years, could not feed the industry with enough satisfaction, with enough support, especially not in the industry, but also in the individual as well. So obviously the frustration do mount under the circumstance. And also, I think one of the gravest mistakes that DPJ had made is they totally truncated the bureaucrats and therefore were not able to implement anything. Now, I do agree with Michael that it is one of the 3 biggest problems that he cited. But you cannot, as in case of like nuclear plants as well in Japan, you cannot truncate it totally right away. Unfortunately or fortunately, the Japanese bureaucrats are the one and have been the one who's been running the show. But to truncate it totally basically meant that the implementation of these policies were not possible, therefore putting us into much more turmoil in the past 3 years. And this is one of the reasons why the Japanese public, as well as the industry, are getting quite agitated. And therefore the lifespan and the popularity, therefore, of these prime ministers are very, very short.
Gerhard Fasol, we're starting to run down the clock here. Let me come to you for a final thought. A new leader should be elected in 2 weeks' time. If you add one more year onto that, seeing as that seems to be the yardstick of the last 6 years, do you expect that leader to still be in charge in a year's time?
It's very difficult to say, you know. A person like Koizumi, I would give him 5 years, yeah. But at the moment, I think none of the candidates who I see at the moment who's standing for election is of that caliber. So, I wouldn't be surprised if whoever the leaders is elected now, I wouldn't be very surprised if he would be replaced again after 1 year. That may well happen, you know. But the way Japanese leadership works is differently than in Europe.
Yeah.
Like our US president, the Japanese prime minister has much less direct execution power than let's say a US president or a French president. Yeah, they rely much more on bureaucracy, on their friends and their their supporters.
Gentlemen, what a very interesting discussion this has been. I want to thank you all today, our guests. We had Michael Penn in Tokyo, Also Seijiro Takeshita in London, and joining us, as you saw on the Skype there from Tokyo, was Gerhard Fasol. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, our viewers, for your company for this edition of Inside Story. Your thoughts, your suggestions, fire them our way. InsideStory@aljazeera.net is the address. I'm Kamahl Santamaria. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.